It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Professor Stephen Smallbone. He's a psychologist and professor at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University. He's director of Griffith Youth Forensic Service and soon to be former Australian Research Council Future Fellow. Former Future. There you go. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Gary. And thanks for having me. One of the many concerning aspects about the sexual abuse of boys, I think, has been the concern that boys experiencing sexual abuse may be at greater risk of going on to sexually abuse others. There is certainly some general evidence that I won't go into in detail today that supports this in a kind of a generic sense. It's, I think, well known that there are many kinds of childhood adversity that are related in some way to many kinds of negative developmental outcomes. The adversities in childhood include abuse, but extend well and truly beyond that, of various kinds. And the outcomes are really diverse as well, ranging from involvement in delinquent behaviour, mental health problems, substance use problems, problems at school, problems in relationships, early pregnancies, etc., etc., etc. The question that I'm wanting to wrestle with for a short period today is this more specific kind of idea that a specific exposure to sexual abuse for boys may have some implications for a very specific outcome of sex offending. And up until now, I think that the evidence for that specific connection hasn't been at all clear. I'm not sure that I'm going to be making it much clearer in the next half hour, but I do have some new data that I'm going to work through with this. The assumption or the idea that there is this specific connection, it really, the weight that professionals sometimes attach to that idea, I was very struck by with a particular circumstance some years ago, having been engaged by the Northern Territory government as it happened. I was wondering whether I should name places, but it does provide some context to what I'm about to tell you, to help to develop a framework for services for adults and adolescents who are in trouble with courts for sex offences. And one of the terms of reference required me to respond to the need or otherwise for services for adolescent or adult sex offenders who disclose sexual abuse while they're engaged in a treatment program for their sex offending. So that caused me to investigate well, there aren't too many places actually to go for these kinds of investigations in the Northern Territory, Darwin and Alice Springs chiefly, to talk to people who were providing services to victims of child sexual abuse. I'm just going to pause. I sound very loud to myself, am I? No? Okay. Anyway, and I discovered that really there was only one service in each of those places that was providing any real therapeutic response to sexual abuse victims. And they had what I thought was a very curious philosophy that they wouldn't see boys who'd turned 12. And I said, why not? And they said, well, because they then present a risk to all of our other clients. We can't have boys who are over 12. So they draw a line, philosophically, I guess, and it connects to this assumption that on your 12th birthday you cease to become a sexual abuse victim, primarily, and begin to be a potential sex offender. And I found that kind of astonishing in a range of ways, not least because of the weakness of the evidence base that we might point to kind of find some kind of support for that idea. So this is one of those cases, I think, where the strongest claims for such a link are based on the weakest methodologies. And the stronger the methodology, the kind of less clear the whole thing becomes. So the data that people often will point to is the apparently extraordinarily high rate of which sex offenders, both adult and adolescent sex offenders in treatment settings, make disclosures about having been sexually abused themselves. And we can see here, by way of summary, that around 30-42% I think captures most of those estimates. But the range is really quite wide, and it ranges up to 75%, and then there are even outliers from there. An early review of these published studies concluded that on average across those studies, this wasn't a meta-analysis, but it was a so-called narrative analysis, or narrative review, concluded that by and large around a third of adults, this is adult sex offenders, in a treatment setting, would report sexual abuse in their own childhood. One of my many hats is as a director of Griffith Youth Forensics Service, which has been operating here in Queensland for about 13 years, seeing young people who are in trouble in the courts, so adjudicated for sex offences. And we've had a really close look at our data, and this is our conclusion. So we too come to this, what seems like a very high prevalence of sexual abuse retrospectively in the backgrounds of these young people. And a lot of that's actually confirmed, not all of it, some of this is based on self-report, but we've given ourselves some reasonable, we think, stringency in the kind of criteria that we use before we're not we're trying not to be rash about these things, is I guess what I'm saying. But still it looks fairly high. Of course, there's a temporal issue here. For adults, you're asking them to go back quite a long way, but for adolescents, often not really. It might just be last year or the year before, that this has occurred. So there are some differences there, I think. There was a fairly recent meta-analysis that was focused really on looking at similarities and differences between adolescent sex offenders and adolescent non-sex offenders on a range of measures. And one of the things that they looked at was the prevalence in those two populations of sexual abuse specifically. And they too, in the same way, retrospectively in a clinical setting, looking back on the problem and asking people to tell them about the past, reported that around, on average, 46% of sex offenders, adolescent sex offenders, and this was much more likely than the non-sexual offenders. Now, if you take away just the self-report, the prevalence figures are quite substantially lower, but that raises other kinds of questions. I mean, going back to Judy's talk this morning about the many, many limitations of the various designs of doing this kind of work. One influential study that was based on a very different design, this is a longitudinal, prospective design I should say, involved an analysis of a large number of known or substantiated maltreatment cases of all kinds, and were able to match most of those cases with individuals from a general population who presumably had not been maltreated. This study concluded that maltreatment generally predicts offending generally. No surprise there. There's a considerable weight of evidence to support that general kind of idea. The question we've got right now is this more specific link though. What's going on there? When they looked at sexual offending specifically, they found much the same thing, that there were the general maltreatment, all kinds of maltreatment tended to predict sex offending, but sexual abuse specifically did not in any direct way. So no specific association between sexual abuse and sexual offending, looking at the problem forwards rather than backwards with a known sample of maltreated children. A couple of problems with this design though was that, firstly it included females who we know are more likely to be abused anyway, and within this sample I think probably accounted for 2/3 or more of the sample. So even though it was a substantial number of cases to begin with, it wasn't a large number of boys in the maltreated sample. But we also know that females are much less likely than males to commit sex offences, or at least to be convicted of sex offences. The other big problem, I think, with the study is it included prostitution as a sex offence. So the conclusions that it drew, I think, are problematic, really. I don't think, to me, there are certain things that define what I think are sexual offences that don't for me, include prostitution. It just has different kind of characteristics to do with consent, some fundamental, kind of issues that I think are definitive. Recently, some colleagues in Victoria conducted a study, reported a study similar in some respects to the Widham design. So, beginning with a group of quite a large number of maltreated children, in this case specifically sexually abused children, and that included 20% males, so a reasonable sized sample of males who were known to have been sexually abused. And this was based on forensic medical examination records over a long period between 1964 and 1995. They also were able to construct a matched sample from the general population, from an electoral roll on a few relevant variables to do with age and so on. It followed for a very long period of time. They found that 70% of the group had no convictions over much of their life course. They found only 31 cases of sex offending as outcomes from a very large number of sexual abuse cases. This still includes the girls, so a very small proportion if you include the girls, 1.1% of the whole maltreated sample. So no link at all between sexual abuse and sexual offending for females. That probably would come as no surprise anyway. But they did find a statistically reliable link between sexual abuse and sexual offending for males. They found that there were 5% of the sexually abused males were convicted of a sexual offence over that period of time, compared to less than 1% of the matched non-abused males. So sexually abused males were 8.2 times more likely to be convicted of a sexual offence. This is sort of fairly impressive if we just look at that figure. That seems like a reasonably big effect within the maltreatment and comparison groups. And the effect was even stronger when they looked at the boys who'd been sexually abused after the age of 12. And one of the reasons for looking at that age cutoff is that it's kind of a proxy, I guess, for the onset of puberty for boys. There has already been some discussion in the literature that sexual abuse during puberty may have a particular kind of effect because it's obviously about sexual awakening. It's it might be counted as a sort of a first meaningful sexual experience for somebody, etc., etc., etc. And the concern about that age cutoff seems to be kind of borne out or supported in these data. So an even higher proportion of the sexually abused males went on to commit sex offences when they were over 12 at the time of the abuse. And this puts that group 3.3 times more likely than the other male sexually abused boys who were abused before 12. So this is looking to me kind of reasonably convincing, but there's some sort of, it's sitting within another story, I think, a bigger story. And that's by way of introduction to what I want to talk to you today about. Now this, I'm going out on a bit of a limb here because these aren't my data. I'm much more comfortable and familiar when I'm involved in the data collection. I understand what's going on, we know what we're doing by way of our research. But when I was asked to come and speak today, I thought, well, there's data in this data set that I know about that might be relevant for this particular topic. So I talked to the people who own this data and they were fine about it, so that's what we're doing now. So this is an administrative birth cohort study. I don't want to get caught up in what we call these things, but people remind me it's not truly a birth cohort study, it's an administrative cohort. And the reason that is because the data come from administrative records. So this is all children, based on a population of all children born in Queensland in over a 2-year period, either 1983 and 1984, who were either the subject of a child protection notification and or received a police caution, had an offence finalised in the children's court or in the adult court, and the census date for the data collection was 2006, when this cohort was 22 and 23 years old. So here are some acknowledgements. This is the people whose data I'm borrowing, and it's not just a kind of a borrowing thing, it's that I'm probably not as familiar with this data as I'd like to be, standing up and presenting findings from it. And in fact, there's one or two things along the way that I'll note that I'm still concerned about. So don't take this as a final word. but this is the best sense so far that I can make of it. So there were 82,000 or so children born in Queensland in those years. Slightly more than 50% were boys, so about 45,000 boys. From that pool, 4,464 had a child protection history, so that's about 10% of the overall cohort of some kind. 615 cases were identified as sexual abuse. Now, one of the issues here is that these aren't all substantiated abuse incidents. As far as I understand it at the moment, we're dealing with notifications and not necessarily substantiations. 615 were sexual abuse. That's about 14% of the maltreated sample, and 1.4% of the whole population from which that sample is drawn. 1,929 physical abuse cases and 1,609 emotional abuse or neglect. We just put those two categories together. Now, one of the things that this already says to me is that when kids are abused, it's actually not mostly sexual abuse. I think the significance that we might give to the sexual abuse specifically, I think it behoves us to recognise that children are harmed in a whole range of ways, not just sexually, and not just through maltreatment. There's a whole lot of things. We support governments to drop bombs on children. And famines. There's lots of stuff that goes on with kids. I think it's helpful to remind ourselves to get this thing in context. But having said that, let's just return to the topic. In terms of offending, one of the problems with tying these maltreatment data to population data are that the population actually changed over the course of these young men's lives. Like, we know Queensland's had a fair bit of interstate migration and probably overseas migration. So you can see here the population increased by 20,000 over the course of these kids' lives up until the age of 22 or 23. So it's a bit hard to kind of find the right denominator, if you like, for some of these calculations. And I'm going to be putting a lot of figures to you over the next 10 or 15 minutes, but they're not complicated ones. It's just descriptive, but it will be a fair bit of figures. I'm going to move through them fairly quickly. So 50,000 or so males now, and of those, nearly 9,000 received a police caution. That's about 18% of the whole cohort. One of the things I find interesting about psychology often, and clinical psychology often, is that we kind of try and compare the people that we're interested to the normal population. You know, I think normal sometimes is a bit wacky and kind of unpredictable and odd. And one of the ways that it is that, in fact, involvement with the criminal justice system is commonplace. So, in that police caution data, we were able to find 128 sexual offences. This isn't individuals, but offences. And they accounted for less than 10% of all the cautioned offences. So it's not a usually cautioned offence, there's not a lot of them, but there's a substantial number in there anyway. About nearly 4,000 in the overall population had a finalised children's court matter, and that was about 7.7% of the overall population. We found 97 sexual offences there, again, incidents rather than people. And again, it accounted for a very small number of finalised offences. 25,000 people had a finalised adult court matter. This is one of the things. I've talked to the people who are the custodians of this data, and they assure me this is true. And I've got no better way of telling whether it is or not, but it seems extraordinary to me. This is half the population. I find it hard to believe, but I mean, the international reports are that 20 to 30% of ordinary people have a formal contact with the police at some point, especially males. And the research on delinquency says that if you include all of the kids that aren't formally dealt with, not engaging in delinquency is statistically abnormal. Some people even say that it's not good for you not to. And that it leads to social anxieties and peer problems. I'm serious. Yes, I'm amused as well, but it's also seriously true that this is part of us as a society. So here we find 221 sexual offences, representing less than 1/3% of all of the sexual offences that were dealt with in the adult criminal courts over that period of time. So this leaves us with a large number, 36,000 males who were born in those 2 years with either a caution or a youth justice or an adult court record. And of those, there were 393 sexual offenders. This represents just about 1% of all offenders. Sexual offending isn't a common offence, officially. And less than 1%, or about 1 in 128 of the population, were either cautioned, went to a children's court or an adult court in relation to a sex offence. Also need to remind you that these aren't proven offences, so we've included, these are the matters that brought them to the attention of the police or to the courts and so on, and we know that some substantial proportion in fact weren't proven, they were dropped in court, but we're including them for the purposes of the analysis today. If we add in those boys who had a child protection history as well, we get an even bigger number, around 38,000, with either a child protection and or an offending history. And this breaks down in this way: about 6% had a child protection history but had no offending history. This isn't just sexual abuse, we're just dealing with child protection histories across the board. A very large proportion with an offending history but no child protection history, so offending is a lot more common than being abused, at least according to the official statistics, much more common, which already weakens the link if you think about it, which we'll come to in a moment. And about 6% who had both a child protection history and an offending history. So going on then and looking at this specific link, what do these data tell us about that link? So of the 615, you might remember, sexually abused boys, 19 were, I'm using the wrong language, I meant to change this. They weren't convicted, they were brought to the attention of authorities for a sex offence. So discard that. That's my error. Of the physically abused boys, almost 2% of those also were convicted of a sex offence. So we organise these into mutually exclusive categories, by the way. I mean, there's a lot of overlap. That's another story about abuse, is that you tend to get abused in multiple ways if you're going to be abused. But we've just selected out the sexual abuse boys, no matter whether they had physical abuse or neglect as well, so they become the first category, and then the others were, physical abuse was the next highest category in the hierarchy, basically, is the way that we did it. Sexually abused boys were 2.7 times more likely than the other maltreated boys to be convicted of sex offences, but most of that difference comes from the difference between the sexually abused boys and the emotionally abused and neglected group. So the physically abused boys are in the middle, really, of this, so to speak. In fact, I think it's true, I don't have the data here today, but I think that the emotionally neglected and emotionally abused and neglected boys were slightly less likely to commit a sex offence than people who hadn't been maltreated at all. There was a negative relationship between neglect and sex offending. So of the large number of boys who had no child protection history, 324 of them were convicted of a sex offence. So the bulk of the sex offenders came not from the child protection pool, but from the non-maltreated pool. And that was less than 1% of that group. However, the sexually abused boys were 3.5 times more likely than the non-maltreated boys to commit sex. There's something going on. This is beyond chance. But it's kind of weakened in a sense. The relationship looks much weaker when you look at it in the context of the overall population. And this is one of the aspects that tends not to be looked at, I think, carefully enough in many of the other studies. We can look at it the other way. I don't know if this quite makes sense, but we can say from the data that sexually abused boys actually are much more likely not to than to as well, as I guess you'd expect. So we end up with 324, or 82% of the sexual offenders had no child protection history at all, and 95% of the sexual offenders did not have a sexual abuse history, according to these data. So what does it all mean? Well, there does seem to be a general relationship between maltreatment and offending, as we began by getting on the table. Some contact with the criminal justice system is common, we know that. More than half in the present study, which I'm still not quite sure I want to believe, but that's what the data are telling me.
Does that have anything to do with the fact that we're the only state that starts at 17?
Well, it might. It might be including some who would otherwise be dealt with in the youth justice system who are being dealt with in the adult system. It might. Yep. 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 I don't imagine that would explain the whole size of this, but it may well contribute to it, yeah. Sex offences are uncommon within the context of general offending. In the present study, only about 1% of all offences and less than 1% of the whole population had been known to or were thought to have committed a sex offence. But there is a specific statistically reliable association between sexual abuse and sexual offending in males exclusively, not in females, but in males. However, a large majority of sexually abused males are not later convicted of sex offences, and most sexual offenders are not sexually abused as children, despite the fact that retrospective studies indicate that there seems to be a higher prevalence than what these data are suggesting. So how can, if there is a specific link, which this study suggests and other studies have suggested, what is that about? How can we explain that? It's something that is a male-only thing. Males are overrepresented in sex offences way more than they're overrepresented in other kinds of offences. It's a standout kind of offence. Males are overrepresented in most kinds of offences, but not to the extent that they are for sex offences, and that's based on both official records and victimisation surveys. Up around at least 90%, more likely 95%. Now, I'm not sure if I'm going to throw a bomb into kind of a biological deniers group, are we? I don't know. But I think there's compelling evidence that one of the explanations is that men are wired differently to women, and that interacts with the socialisation effect. I do not accept that the whole story of outcomes, the different outcomes of male and female behaviour, can be explained on socialisation alone. I think we're not blank slates. We're human animals. But there's certainly an effect of socialisation involved. One way of thinking about this is that sexual abuse might provide some kind of concrete model for boys. I can remember as a 5 and 6 year old knowing that sexual abuse occurred. It wasn't going on for me, but I kind of had a loose idea that it might have been going on. It was a very abstract idea. You know, I knew that the world wasn't always a safe place. But I suspect that for people who have sexual abuse experiences, that idea becomes much more kind of concrete and real than it would to somebody who's left with just this kind of abstract idea that might happen, that can happen. And that this might, through social learning mechanisms like vicarious learning and participant modelling, have an effect. Sexual abuse might trigger some kind of sexual anxiety. I don't personally like the word sexualisation. I don't quite know what that means. We are already sexual. I don't know about sexualised people, but then I have a problem sometimes with language. Sexual abuse triggers something to do with anxieties or preoccupations perhaps that might increase the susceptibility of those young boys to some kind of age-inappropriate or non-consensual sex. Clearly, however, and this is really the take-home message, I think, sex abuse is neither a necessary nor sufficient condition. Quite obviously, there are just no data that would suggest otherwise. And I would say that it's really, if you want to understand why sex offences occur, you want to look at what's going on at the moment that they occur. That's where it comes from. There may well be contributions come from years earlier, but I think there are lots of errors to make in assuming that there are distal causes when you could examine proximal causes and discover things there. So just quickly then, what is to be done? This is my last slide. From the point of view of the topic that we're here to talk about today, then clearly it's a no-brainer. We want to reduce boys' exposure to sexual abuse, don't we? That would be the kind of primary goal. And I think for that we need a more focused type of research that just asks the basic questions. I don't get sometimes in this field that there's an attraction to kind of esoteric questions and a kind of a dullness about the basic foundations, and we aren't on good foundations. This whole evidence base has got shaky foundations, and we need to kind of dig them back up and fill in a bit of concrete and keep the whole thing a bit more stable. We need to know where this happens, when it happens, how it happens, who's involved. And that is fundamental knowledge for informing primary and secondary prevention strategies. If we don't know those things, then we're going to be stabbing at the dark if we're wanting to kind of prevent it. Obviously, even if we have very great prevention programs, which I don't think we do, but even if we did, hypothetically, there would still be people falling through the nets. We're going to have people who do have this experience. The next step then, obviously, is to reduce negative outcomes for those people. I think from a research point of view, we really need to pay attention to the wide variations. I don't accept that there is a single outcome, and I don't think anybody's making that case. But I still think we're prone to assuming, despite saying that there kind of is. There's lots of evidence to show that there's very wide variations in the outcomes for children, and boys included. There are also an array of factors. It's not, the outcomes aren't associated with just what went on with one person touching somebody else or doing something sexual with them. We know that negative outcomes can also be predicted by things that happened before that abuse happened. We know that it can be predicted by things that happened afterwards as well. And that needs to be disentangled and I think looked at in a kind of a frank way. We need to consider the effects of various responses and interventions to children and men who have been sexually abused. A colleague of mine once remarked, because my professional background is working with offenders, and a colleague of mine remarked that, for years, decades, our work has been carried out in the context of demands from government agencies to demonstrate outcomes, as in reduce recidivism. That's hard to do, but that's what's being asked. And she remarked that victim services don't seem to be held to the same level of accountability, as though anything that you do with a victim has got to be good. Really? So I think that there's some facing up to do about what are people doing, and we ought not assume that it's all good. Because there's no evidence in other areas that that's true. We know that some interventions can be harmful or ineffective. Nearly done. I think that sounding the alarm in the sense of the kind of these sort of forums can, and I think are likely to reduce the prevalence, actually. If you look at Finkelhor's data in the US, he reckons that the incidence of sexual abuse has declined by as much as 50% year by year since 1993. An enormous decline in sexual abuse in the United States. There's a lot of debate about whether that's true or not. Finkelhor himself says this is real. We're trying to work out what's going on. I think, and when we look at it in the Catholic Church too, the big problem of abuse in the Catholic Church peaked in the late 1960s and early 1970s, has declined enormously since then. And we can also plot with the Catholic Church an inverse relationship with reporting. As more and more people reported it, less and less of it happened. And what I think that's about is that it increases the perceived risk and decreases the permissibility of people who think they can get away with this kind of thing. So talking about it is good, in a sense, but I think we need to be careful about how we talk about it, because I think there's another side to this, that it risks increasing the harms for victims. That's the price. I think you've got to be careful what we say to victims about what they should experience, because they're looking to people like you and me and to their family to tell them. So if we tell them that they've been wrecked, then that's probably how they're going to think that they're expected to be. How about we find out from them? I think would be a good idea. Just a quick anecdote as I leave. I was in the UK recently and heard the head of the police in the UK talking about an online, offence where they'd found a girl who'd had pornographic pictures taken, and he made a public statement. This had wrecked her life. It offended me because well, maybe it did, but maybe it didn't, and it was just an assumption. It was a throwaway line. It's wrecked her life. I mean, I hope she wasn't listening. I'll leave it there.